In addition to the overland Silk Roads, this period also saw an increase in maritime trade. Up until the time of Columbus coming to America and the creation of global oceanic trade, the Indian Ocean was the largest sea based system of trade and communication. Sea based trade was quite a bit cheaper than overland trade of the Silk Roads because the ships could carry a lot more than a camel could, and eventually the sea roads would be able to carry non luxury items. Trade in the Indian Ocean basin was made possible by predictable monsoons. In winter, the winds blew east, and in summer, the winds blew west. So, like the Silk Roads, we had various port cities emerge, and these cities were dependent on the trade. The earliest evidence of trade in the Indian Ocean basin is between Mesopotamia and the ancient Indus Valley Harappan civilization. By the 2nd century, the Roman Empire had established settlements in southern India and along the East African coast, and Chinese merchants had reached India. The port cities of India served as a meeting place between East and West. During the post-classical era, there were two major events that increased the importance of the sea roads and sea-based trade. The first that we'll look at in this unit is the economic and political revival of China in the form of the Tang Dynasty and later the Song Dynasty. And this happened 4 centuries after the collapse of the Han Dynasty. The Tang and Song dynasties ruled for 600 consecutive years and actively encouraged maritime trade. The second was the rise of Islam, which we'll also look at in depth in this unit. So Islam arose throughout Eurasia and Africa, and Islam, like Buddhism, was a merchant's religion. The founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, was himself a merchant. The creation of an Arab empire that stretched from India to the Atlantic Ocean brought a huge territory with many different economies under one political system. Like the Silk Roads, oceanic trade transformed civilizations. The biggest cultural changes can be seen in Southeast Asia and East Africa, which were the two bookends of the Indian Ocean basin. In Southeast Asia, oceanic trade provided the wealth that created kingdoms like Srivijaya, which dominated the Straits of Malacca between the years 670 and 1025, and this was a critical point between China and India. Srivijaya grew into a major center for Buddhist thought and teaching. So the oceanic trade created the wealth that made many of the kingdoms and great monuments of Southeast Asia possible. Pictured here is the Khmer Kingdom of Angkor Wat. So that's in modern-day Cambodia, and you can see the Hindu and Buddhist influence. The spreading of Buddhist culture in Southeast Asia is unique in a sense because it wasn't accompanied by any imperial control from India. So we saw how the Greeks and the Romans spread their culture, but it was always accompanied with a political controller. So it was part of a larger empire. In Southeast Asia, the concepts of Buddhists, they were adapted from the merchants, and in many cases they were changed to work with the local culture. At the other end of the Indian Ocean, on the east coast of Africa, we see the rise of Swahili civilization, stretching along the coast from Somalia to Mozambique. And initially, these were small fishing and farming villages that were stimulated by the Indian Ocean trade. African gold, ivory, animal skins, and even slaves found markets in Arabia, Persia, and India. And an East African merchant class emerged. Cities became kingdoms, chiefs became kings, and Swahili civilization eventually became an Islamic civilization due to the contact they had with Islamic merchants. So I talked about trade along the Silk Roads, and I talked about trade in the Indian Ocean basin. The last form of long-distance trade I want to talk about happened within Africa, and it was trade between the people of North Africa and the people of West Africa. Historically, these people were separated from each other by a natural boundary, which was the Sahara Desert. The introduction of the camel to Africa made long-distance trade between North Africa and West Africa possible. So camels are really the only pack animal that could handle the Sahara Desert. Typical camel caravan across the Sahara would consist of as many as 5,000 camels and hundreds of people, and merchants would travel all night to avoid the heat. They covered around 20 miles a day, so a typical expedition would take around 70 days. So these are long-term expeditions. The political impact of the trade was huge. This trade created the wealth and incentive for new large West African civilizations. And between the years 500 and 1600, a number of West African monarchies emerged. So these include Ghana, Mali, Songhai, and West Africa possessed a great deal of gold, which helped make these kingdoms very, very rich. So, if the Silk, Sea, and Sand roads linked the people of Eurasia, were there similar trading networks in the Western Hemisphere? In short, the answer is not really. Networks of exchange in America were less established than Eurasia. The Aztecs and the Inca, who both ruled over large empires at the time of European contact, had no direct contact with each other, and it appears as they had very limited indirect contact. So, for example, the llama and the potato were both domesticated in the Andes, but they never reached Mesoamerica. Writing, that was invented by the Maya, never reached the Andes. And some of the reasons behind this are written about in Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. But for one, there were no horses, donkeys, camels, or wheeled vehicles, no large ocean-going vessels in America that could move goods. The geography of America made it difficult to pass, especially Central America. So you have Panama. It's very thin. It's dense. It's covered in dense forests. So it makes traveling through it very difficult. Talk about moving crops and the difficulty of transplanting crops north to south. It's much easier to move a crop from east to west than it is from north to south. So there were some natural barriers to trade. With that being said, trade, of course, did happen. You learned in Canadian history last year that by the time of European contact, there were already well-established trading networks in what is now Canada and the United States between Aboriginal. So, what I wanted to do with this podcast was just to give you an introduction to the post-classical world and sort of let you know where we're going over the next 6 weeks or so. So just looking at the slide here, next week we're looking at China during the Tang and Song dynasties, followed by European Christianity, and then Islam, the Mongol moment in world history, followed by a closer look at the American civilization, so the Incas, the Maya, the Aztecs, and finally tropical Africa and Asia. So that's West Africa, South Africa, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. So with that, I'll end this week's podcast, and thank you for listening.